This is what an emerging and more emboldened opposition to this Musk-Trump agenda looks like. Today, top Democrats using their powers to grind the Senate to a halt over selected Trump nominees. I'm going to show you the Senate floor right now as this has continued in the midst of the Democrats seizing the floor agenda for 30 hours, trying to yoke Elon Musk's controversial plans to President Trump and some of these pending nominees, including a Project 2025 leader who Donald Trump tapped to now run the nation's budget. That's a key perch if you want to implement Project 2025 across the country, even as candidate Trump famously campaigned by claiming to disavow the 2025 governing plan, while Democrats hammered this today.
I have nothing to do with Project 2025.
He is Donald Trump's most dangerous nominee.
Behind every one of these budget lines are people.
This man, Russell Vought, and it is our job to say, stop.
People who will be hurt if the president and Mr. Vought get their way.
Vought has shown complete disregard for democratic institutions.
Vought has said we live in a, quote, post-constitutional time. That's what he believes we're in. Do my colleagues agree with that?
This is, however, a constitutional time. Trump's push to issue those many orders that go beyond his powers and have been overruled by the Constitution have actually drawn attention to the constitutional time we're living in, to quote Senator Murray there, to the limits on any president's power. It's drawn attention to how the Constitution and courts also guide this nation, not just one politician holding executive orders that now, some of them are quite ceremonial or more like a little symbolic antique of a couple of days of a presidency, because as the headlines show, they have been blocked, stopped in their tracks. The Constitution is part of what rules this country, not one politician. You can see that contrast. It's unfolded fast because some of Trump's actions were not close calls. I've told you we've covered and lived together through cases that took years because they were complicated and close, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court. This is not that. His lawyers and aides could have seen these headlines coming. They surely know the Constitution is above politicians on key issues. No politician can cancel the First or 14th Amendment. It's actually the opposite. Those exist to constrain politicians from abusing power. And if this sounds like a little bit of a throwback history lesson or a little bit of law school, this is news right now, I assure you, because of rulings like this today. Another judge rebuking Trump for viewing law as an impediment, something to ignore, in a ruling reiterating something we know, that the Constitution's citizenship language is final. It overrides and overpowers any effort by a president, including this one, to cancel it. With the judge noting, this is not something which the government may play policy games with. Quote, if the government, that's a reference to President Trump, wants to change the exceptional American grant of birthright citizenship, it needs to amend the Constitution itself. It's actually the third judge in a row to do so, ruling against and thwarting Trump's clearly unlawful claim that he would just personally alter the Constitution's definition of citizenship. Another judge ruling today against a Musk effort, pausing that unelected billionaire's demand that federal workers have to quit on his terms. Elon Musk had announced a kind of made-up deadline that he said was for workers to quit and take a buyout. And you can see how perception can shape reality when the government wages war on both law and facts. Because some people might have thought, when announced this way amidst all this chaos, that it was a real deadline, that it might be the best deal as a federal worker they could come up with if they were going to be ousted anyway. But tonight, I could show you a different reality coming into view. There actually is no deadline tonight because the U.S. government is not following one. Musk said it. The government said, no, thank you. That's not how this works. And it will take longer to hash out. So this may be a power Musk does not have, certainly not right now tonight. And the courts and the Congress also govern this country. They may have a different tack on how workers are paid, or if there are departing workers, what they get. There is a normal and orderly way to do this. Sometimes the federal workforce grows and shrinks in different departments for different priorities. That is okay. And if the Republicans win an election and plan to, through Congress and law, scale back the federal workforce within the rules in the Constitution, that is okay. You could say that's what they were elected to do. In these first 2 weeks, though, President Trump has shown little interest in doing those things on an orderly or legal basis with the Congress. Elon Musk clearly not. He is rushing for his power, even as it's narrowed by another federal judge who is limiting how much of the Treasury data that Musk seeks, how much he can get. So just right there, it's a lot. Now, what is going on? If I can try to just jump through all of these rulings and these other developments, and of course I haven't hit everything yet. What's going on with all of this? Well, I think there are signs that some of this ongoing blitz that we're experiencing, this Musk-Trump approach, is deliberately designed to get some chaos and try to get results out of that. You've probably heard the shorthand for that type of strategy. People talk about flooding the zone or shock and awe or deliberate distraction and then move the line for what is shocking or acceptable and get something out of that. Some people say it's Donald Trump's negotiating style mixed with the show, quote unquote. There may be aspects of that, but it is not all three-dimensional chess, as we have noted in our coverage, because we've seen errors and mistakes and incompetence. And it's also clear when it comes to what I just mentioned with Elon Musk, some other parts of this are just the classic shoot-first approach. And that's an old kind of cliched posture for a reason. It's long been criticized. It's almost automatically bad if you say someone's shooting first, because it's dangerous. Duh. It's rarely strategic. And when you see people do this in real life, not the movies, it's often people who have kind of a supposed self-proclaimed tough type persona, and then it turns out some of them are not that tough or shrewd at all. The loud, brash, and often failing moves here are also yielding their own pushback, which is part of the story, part of what's happening. There are anti-MAGA and anti-Elon Musk's protests happening around the country with signs against Elon Musk. He is finding that his standing is, in this country at least, very polarized. He might be embraced on part of the right, but he is also widely opposed around the country. And remember, he has business interests, he has consumer-facing products. He is seeing these signs against him. While the architect of Donald Trump's first winning campaign, Steve Bannon, is coming at Musk from a different vantage point, arguing that Musk is a kind of phony imposter out for himself, who's only pretending to back Trump's populist agenda, when in fact, Bannon argues Musk is about Musk and his tech and his money. Quote, he's not a populist. He's in this group of hardcore techno-federalists, Bannon told the New York Times. And while there's surely some politics here, the rivalry might be about access to Trump or who's positioned to carry the MAGA flame forward, we can also see something kind of interesting. Steve Bannon's listed concerns overlap with some of what the Democratic leaders are saying and some of what the general public is concerned about. So it may be strange bedfellows that work against Musk, while this type of ongoing conflict and controversy and media attention could hurt Musk's relationship with Trump. I remind you of Exhibit A Time magazine covered, which Bannon learned is how complicated it can be to work for Donald Trump, even at a high level, and also get your own press and attention. Ultimately, Bannon's press got in the way of his power in the Trump White House, for those who want to go down memory lane. Now, Musk just said to his allies this week the time is short, that they've got to do this stuff now and fast, and it might be their, quote, only opportunity. Could be just more rhetoric from someone who is skilled at marketing and rhetoric in his own way. Could also be the politically savvy billionaire understands what I just mentioned, that there is a pickle here of working through Trump through his power and prestige when he is himself a jealous co-pilot. Musk trying to barrel ahead quickly. He wants the data for millions of federal employees. He's invading multiple agencies, even though he's not a cabinet leader for any one of them, rushing to mess with or get data about what are very popular healthcare programs, including for seniors, dispatching his own teams, not Trump's, to pressure labor and CDC officials. And you'll notice a theme here I want to draw your attention to, because the press apparently can matter. We've seen the press, the revelations, and even the courts respond to what we're learning. As always, we're indebted to a lot of our colleagues in print and other fields who are digging this stuff up. Here, the Post reporting on his advisory group securing and wanting to get a hold of, quote, sensitive data. Same deal over at Veterans Affairs, where Musk wants access to their computer systems. That's courtesy of some military.com reporting. We can't cover everything. Nobody can. But we're zeroing in on some aspects of this to look at the consequences. And then you have how Elon Musk has long cultivated a bad boy billionaire aura, even before he was disinterested in American politics or the enrichment of his companies through American politics. Like Donald Trump, Musk has some fans who really like that idea or rep that he has cultivated, the idea of his life and lifestyle and living like him. There's a song, DDG with Gunna, that sings a whole lot of money in the safe, don't worry about us. This smoke gonna take me straight to space like I'm Elon Musk. Now, the simple idea is that it sounds like it could be wild or fun to live like Elon Musk. And that could be. It's a free country. You can imagine that or want that life. But remember, that's about living like the cartoon imagined hype of being Elon Musk, of being that rich, and of going to space. But the more pertinent question, in reality, not fiction, is what about living under Elon Musk in a world where he takes your job and your data, and he certainly doesn't have extra seats for you to join him in space. More likely, you'll be in line for unemployment while he will use your tax dollars to fund another one of his crypto self-enrichment schemes and then posts online that it's all a big joke. Well, who is the joke on? Is that what people want? And is it what they voted for?
We have a lot of news to get to today, including a legal battle over buyouts for much of the federal workforce, the fate of the federal government's aid agency, the single largest donor of humanitarian aid in the world. It is right now up in the air. But we begin today with an urgent warning for every American from someone deep inside the country's top law enforcement agency, an agency already functionally decapitated, as friend of this program, Frank Figliuzzi, puts it, by the Trump administration and facing threats from now pardoned January 6 defendants. Our colleague Ken Dilanian reports that a message has been circulating in FBI circles from an FBI agent. It is believed to reflect the feelings of many inside that organization. We'll read that message to you. Quote, I offer this vignette free of political bias or moral judgment. It is not about any one person, but an amalgamation of multiple FBI special agents. I am the coach of your child's soccer team. I sit next to you on occasion in religious devotion. I'm a member of the PTA. With friends, you celebrated my birthday. I collected your mail and took out your trash while you were away from home. I played a round of golf with you. I'm a veteran. This is the quiet side of me that you do not know. I orchestrated a clandestine operation to secure the release of an allied soldier held captive by the Taliban. I prevented an ISIS terrorist from boarding a commercial aircraft. I spent 3 months listening to phone intercepts in real time to gather evidence needed to dismantle a violent drug gang. I recruited a source to provide critical intelligence on Russian military activities in Africa. I rescued a citizen being tortured to near death by members of an outlaw motorcycle gang. I interceded and stopped a juvenile planning to conduct a school shooting. I spent multiple years monitoring the activities of deep cover foreign intelligence officers, leading to their arrest and deportation. I endured extensive hardship to infiltrate a global child trafficking organization. I have been shot in the line of duty. Something else about me? I was assigned to investigate a potential crime. Like all previous cases I have investigated, this one met every legal standard of predication and procedure. I'm now sitting in my home listening to my children play and laugh in the backyard, oblivious to the prospect that their father may be fired in a few days. Fired for conducting a legally authorized investigation. Fired for doing the job that he was hired to do. I have to wonder, when I'm gone, who will do the quiet work that is behind the facade of your average neighbor. That's where we start today. With me at the table, NBC News law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter, and former federal prosecutor and former lawyer with the DOJ National Security Division, Brendan Ballou is back. Tom Winter, I imagine as someone who understands and has reported on the FBI for a long time that this rings true to you.
I mean, definitely. I can hear, I don't know who this individual was. I didn't get the email, but I mean, I can imagine a whole bunch of people that I've met over the years that are special agent men and women that could fit this exact same bill. It's a very weird time for the FBI, just generally, let alone the January 6th threat, which I'll get to. The first one being, it's kind of the best of times and the worst of times. If you look at some of the priorities that the administration is shifting to, and you're an agent and you're thinking about transnational crime, you're thinking about drug cartels and the tools that they'll now be able to use to go after them, areas that have really frustrated you for decades, and certainly the last decade, you're thinking, wow, we can really perhaps put some points on the board and do some damage. There also is going to be a changeover at the Bureau, some things that the FBI do need to change. If Chris Wright was sitting here next to me, he would be the first to say it. That's point one. On the other hand, there was certainly work being done at the FBI last week. 2 top 10 most wanted list arrests. There were a number of cases that they brought and were culminating and working on. But now you're thinking approximately 4,000 agents, maybe up to just shy of 5,000 agents that have had their hands on this in some way or the other. And it's not the people that replied to my posts on this story on Twitter saying, well, if it was 5,000 agents, then they must not have been too busy the past couple of years. No, it's not that. It's just somebody who gets a phone call and says, hey, can you go interview Nicole? She might have some information about somebody who was at the riot on January 6th. Hey, can you go, Nicole, you're on the SWAT team, and today we're going after a drug dealer. Yesterday was a terrorist. Today was somebody who sprayed bear spray in a cop's face on January 6th. That's your job. You're taking that as a court-authorized search warrant, a court-authorized arrest warrant. You're going out there and doing your thing. And people were really concerned towards the end of last week. It's abated a little bit, not a whole heck of a lot. Both current and former agents who may be in other law enforcement capacities, who may have their clearances, who may have jobs that still help this country's security, now thinking, what's next? I'm walking around with a baby grand piano over my head. Am I going to lose that clearance? Or if I'm active FBI, where am I going to go to? And one of the things that the FBI has specific skills. And sure, they could be hired by their local police department, but they're not going to be hired at the sergeant, lieutenant, captain level. They're going to have to start their careers all over again. That's a lot for families. And they already give up a lot. There's not OT per se in the FBI. They spend a lot of time away from their families. If you're on a surveillance squad, it's 24/7, not 24/7 surveillance. You're not on it 24/7, but it's a lot of time away. You've devoted a lot of that to your mission because you believe in it. It's not a security guard job, not to knock that, but it's not that type of a job. You have to be going out there and trying to make cases. And so I think when you look at it, for them, there's an awful lot for them to be concerned about. And the longer this kind of hangs over their heads, I think that there's really some consternation. And of course, it does naturally draw away attention. If my job was on the line sitting here today with you, I might not be fully focused on what I'm about to say because you're thinking about your family, you're thinking about your livelihood. So those are all things that are in play. The other thing that's at play is, and there's a saying, IRS CI teams say it, FBI agents say it, big cases, when it comes to publicity, big problems. And so we've seen in the case of Joe Ziegler, he was one of the whistleblowers in the IRS case. He was the one who opened the investigation into Hunter Biden. His whole life has been changed because of all the attention that that case brought and the eventual guilty plea that came out of it. If you're a federal agent, think about all the cases involving members of Trump's circle over the years. Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Mike Flynn, everything we've been talking about for the last 8 years. What is the incentive to go out and open that case? To go to your supervisor and say, hey, I found out so-and-so might be up to something that's no good. And I'm not saying there's anybody that's under active criminal investigation. Hopefully there's nobody that should have been under active criminal investigation that wasn't ultimately charged here in this whole administration. But we know the way that people are. And every administration, particularly the last several, has had some sort of an issue swirling around it. Whether people agree with it or don't, whether they think it should be looked into or not, it doesn't matter. There's been issues around all of these administrations, certainly in the first Trump administration. So when you look at this, what is the incentive for that FBI agent to open that case into a member of Trump's inner circle? I can't think of one because it sounds like you're potentially asking for an automatic pink slip.
Well, I'm trying to listen for what you are and are not saying, and surely you're not arguing that the last 4 years were akin to the previous 4 years. I mean, the previous 4 years, the first Trump administration, Trump started by asking Jim Comey to see to it to let Mike Flynn go, who pleaded guilty twice in open court.
No doubt.
So the FBI's also the last president never maligned the FBI once. So again, I just want to be really honest with our audience. This is not a bureau that had the same experience the last 4 years as the previous 4.
No, that's not the equivalent. But the equivalent is when you're in these cases that are big publicity cases, headquarters becomes involved, different procedures become involved, and all of a sudden, if you're, I'm trying to put you in the shoes of the agent who's opening the case.
I want to know what it's like
these cases
to be
in a Biden administration. What do you think now, given the last 2 weeks?
I get that. But there's never been an agent in the FBI's history who's gone to work for the author of a book with an enemies list, with the last Republican-appointed Attorney General on it, Bill Barr. What is that like?
Yeah, and I think that's the situation where you're coming into and you're saying, is it the guy who said the things he said in front of the Senate trying to testify for his job? Or is it the guy that wrote the book, to your point, in the things he said in the enemies list and things like that? And so I think that you look at that and you say, well, that's the book that the person wrote. Where does their real heart lie?
It's not like a college essay, though. I mean, it's a book he wrote last year.
Yeah, I don't think I need to spell it out for anybody. I mean, that's clearly like, this is what this guy's thoughts are. This is what he believes in.
I mean, if they're asked to investigate Brendan, who prosecuted January 6 cases, what will they do?
I think that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road. And I think that's something that we'll have to watch over the coming couple of years. And I think there's a feeling among the older guard of the FBI, which is if those types of things are coming forward, that's where an agent, that letter that you read when you started the show, that person who plays golf with their neighbor, who goes to school choir practices or goes to school soccer games that you know, that's when that agent now has to make a determination, do I quit my job on principle? And that's going to be a really tough place for them to be because of how it impacts their livelihood. That's what we've been reporting on. And that's a situation I think, a lot of them are going to say, I might have to resign. And that's a tough spot to put somebody in that space. It's brutal.
It is a consequence of the election. Elections have consequences. But prosecuting you is something Trump has talked about on the campaign trail. It's something Pam Bondi refused to rule out in her confirmation hearings. It's something, as I think Tom is insinuating, Kash Patel was to be the most generous, opaque on. But tell me what the nightmare scenario is for you.
Well, the nightmare scenario, I suppose, for me personally, or for any of the prosecutors that were involved in January 6, would be political prosecutions against us. But I think that this president would really like the narrative to be him versus the prosecutors. I don't think anybody's better equipped to handle the stresses of the legal system than lawyers and prosecutors in particular. The folks that I really worry about are the agents that you're just talking about. You know, identifying 5,000 agents that were involved in the January 6 investigations and potentially revealing those names to the public. This goes part and parcel with the pardons of the rioters from a few weeks ago. You know, the purpose of those pardons was to empower vigilantes and militias that were loyal to the president, but ultimately unaccountable to the government. And if these names are released, that gives those vigilantes, those militias, a target.
What legal footing does the Trump administration have to try to offer this many 2 million employees a buyout?
It's not really clear, Katie. And I think one of the things that's even less clear now is when that offer, to the extent that it's legal, even expires. Because in the wake of this judge's ruling, you have the White House press secretary now going out and saying that they are grateful to this judge in Boston for extending the buyout offer. You'll recall that we have public reporting, including from our own NBC News, saying that they weren't going to extend the buyout offer, that the deadline was the deadline. But now, faced with this ruling from a federal judge, essentially staying any implementation of the buyout plan, they are now embracing that and claiming that this gives more people an opportunity to take a buyout offer, the legality of which is in question to begin with.
I'm curious about what this is going to mean. I mean, the Republicans have been arguing the federal government is bloated for years now, for decades. And there are probably a lot of people out there, Elaine, who say, yes, the federal government has too many employees, the bureaucracy is too big, we could probably cut it down. But the way in which they're doing this, by offering a buyout, are you going to get the people you don't necessarily need to take the buyout? I mean, they're implying that everybody is just lazy, they don't want to go to work. And they're implying that all those folks are just going to want to take the buyout so they can stay at home and watch Netflix. Is that who's going to take that money?
Listen, nobody knows, okay? Back in the Clinton administration, we passed a buyout bill in 1994, and it said that the government could offer up to $25,000 to have people leave office. Now, first of all, there's another legal question other than the one just mentioned, which is, if you run through the $25,000 in the first couple months of your buyout before September 30th, are you going to get all your money? Or is the government going to say, oh, no, sorry, $25,000 is the limit? So that's one problem. The second problem is this is being done in a blunderbuss way, right? It's just being done sort of in a silly way because you don't know who's going to take it. What if 10%, 15% of the 14,000 air traffic controllers in the country took the buyout? Uh-oh, we're in trouble. We don't have people to land planes. We don't have people to take off planes. Suddenly, you don't have landing slots at airports. Travel slows down, and everybody's mad at you. So doing this in this way has a lot of unintended consequences and a lot of blowback.
I want to just focus on that. I mean, you're talking about air traffic controllers. That would be crucial. Tom, what other agencies would you be looking at? What other positions would you be looking at that help make the government function and function well?
This is part of the problem. I think most people don't understand exactly how the government functions, and that even a person who's a GS-9 or a GS-10 who works in administration helps to keep the government running every day. Support staff, everybody from scientists to the people that make sure that the internal mail gets delivered. These are large organizations, and there's this goofy notion that somehow, again, as you said, people are just sitting around, watching Netflix and plotting around their homes. It's such an inane approach to reducing the federal workforce, which can be reduced. Let me just say, I am a former federal worker. I retired 2 years ago, so I did my part. You're welcome, America. But that's not the way to do it. And the other unintended blowback here is that you might get people who were going to retire anyway, who are just taking this now as making their retirement that much more expensive to the government. If the government can actually do any of this or pull it off. I mean, then you're going to have situations and agencies where people have kind of retired in place and you can't replace them because you don't have hiring authority. Because, of course, that's the point of this, is to just empty out offices. But that takes a lot of power away from the agencies to talk about which people they can live without. This could affect every agency from stuff that deals with nuclear weapons all the way down to, whether your checks get delivered every month from the government.
They've exempted defense. They say they're exempting folks who work on national security. I just looked up buyouts for air traffic controllers because I wasn't sure if they were exempt, Elaine, and I got a note saying that they were initially offered buyouts, but then that was rescinded after the deadly plane crash. But just to keep going on that point, Tom, on who exactly is going to take this, I want to talk about the people that aren't obviously workers in the national security apparatus. I mean, if you're not one of the obvious, I sit here and I monitor these direct phone lines, and I'm the one who has the monitor that says, there could be a dirty bomb coming from this place or that place, whatever. If you're not one of those direct employees, how much of the apparatus is there to support those specific jobs? And are we really putting our national security at risk by offering willy-nilly buyouts to 2 million federal employees?
Well, there are people who work in national security. I worked for the Defense Department. I was a professor for the Navy. I could retire and I wouldn't be missed. But you don't want to keep pulling sticks out of this giant Jenga pile to start trying to figure out where the one place is where things start to come unraveled and the whole thing falls down. So, you can talk about exempting people at certain agencies or in certain positions, but I don't think that that's going to be very helpful. Again, I think that, the people at the top who would be told, look, you can't retire or you can't take this deal, you have a crucial job. They rely on support staff. They rely on dozens, thousands, hundreds and thousands of people who do other jobs. And I think that's part of the problem is that, just saying everybody can retire at will is, I think, can have unexpected consequences, even if you carve out those senior positions above them. But they want to reduce the federal workforce. This is one way to do it, I guess.
Lisa, talk about what Tom mentioned on the buyouts and the freeze in hiring.
Well, the intersection of these two things is what's so potentially dangerous, Katie, because there's an executive order that President Trump issued in his first week of office that freezes all federal hiring across a panoply of programs. It was so vast that even interns at the Department of Justice had their offers to become summer interns next summer rescinded. Given that, and given how indiscriminate the federal buyout program is, given that we don't know where people are going to come from, that in combination with the hiring freeze makes it impossible for us to project exactly what the results are going to be. But if it does have an unprojected or even unwanted impact on a particular function of the government, that hiring freeze is a huge impediment to fixing any unexpected consequences.
It's so clunky. It's not done with any precision, Elaine. And part of it is, it's kind of like if you're going to do a takeover of a tech company, just fire as many people as, like Elon Musk did with Twitter. Just fire everybody, see what stops working, and then I can rebuild that thing and make it work again. I'll know how many people I need and whether there was too many there in the first place. The federal government isn't like a tech company. It's much more complicated, much more convoluted. There are so many more things that are at risk. It's not just does a like button on Twitter function or are my direct messages protected, which, you could be concerned about. But, I mean, this is like, are you going to get your Social Security check? Are you going to be able to go to the DMV and get your license? Is your passport going to get renewed? Are the airport workers going to be there in customs and immigration? I mean, there's all sorts of things that go into the federal government that you don't, I think what you think of off the top of your head is it's a bunch of bureaucrats, paper pushers who walk into an office every day and just, are checking boxes. And there's probably some of those folks that are probably not necessary to the federal government, but there's so much more going on there. If you were going to do this surgically and effectively, how would you go about it?
Well, I'd copy the way we did it in 1993 through 2000 in the Clinton administration. We had teams that looked at every single agency. We looked at what was going well, what was going badly. We offered buyouts to people who we didn't think were necessary anymore, who were in middle management jobs that really the internet and computerization had made obsolete. We took a targeted approach, agency by agency, function by function, so that you didn't have people who are 67 and trying to apply for Social Security. You didn't have them waiting on the telephone for 5 hours before somebody could talk to them. So again, I would do an agency by agency approach, and you look at your goals before you offer the buyouts and before you go into any RIFs or downsizing.
There is, though, when it comes to USAID, a private pressure campaign. We haven't necessarily seen it in large fashion from lawmakers on the Hill publicly, though some of them have questioned exactly what's going on here and the downsides of it. But even Bill Gates told our colleague Savannah Guthrie last night in an interview that he spent time at the White House yesterday. He talked for a brief time with Trump, talked for a long while with Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and made the case to them in part that what they're doing, dismantling USAID, has very negative ramifications. I had another former Trump appointee who served in the first administration in the State Department coming on and saying, I've spent my life works at PEPFAR. I've spent my life working within U.S. agencies like this one. This is life or death stakes here when you talk about toying with and potentially ripping apart USAID. So it's not like the pushback isn't there, but do you think it would work?
I think it needs to be sustained. It reminds me a little bit of the kind of 1990s in the war in Bosnia, when you had night after night, you had reporters in Sarajevo reporting back what was happened, and finally Bill Clinton got involved and we had the Dayton Accords and something happened. Now, if you had a pressure campaign, I was watching CBS News actually last night at the risk of naming a competitor, and there was a fantastic report from Sudan with literally starving children taking food from USAID pouches. The USAID has been fantastic at advertising the fact that it's American. So whenever you see those big sacks, they have USAID written on it for a reason. It is the soft power. Now, I think if there was a campaign, a sustained media campaign showing these children, this tiny baby was literally there drinking from a USAID bottle. That child won't survive if it doesn't get that USAID aid. I don't think Americans are appreciating yet what the impact of this cut will have. But if they start to see that, Americans won't like it. And I think President Trump could be susceptible to that pressure, public pressure campaign. But I look at Elon Musk and the glee with which he is destroying this agency. I'm calling them worms, calling them evil, calling them vicious. And saying he sent the agency to the wood chipper. He's reveling in getting rid of this agency. So Trump is kind of between. Is there enough of a public pressure campaign that highlights the good work that USAID does for people, but also for Americans, against this move of these must all be woke liberals, we have to get rid of them?
There really is something so horrifying about a child starving in Sudan being far more likely to starve to death because the world's richest man is going around calling people that are administering that aid worms. And let me explain this again for those who have ears to hear. David Ignatius, when the United States provides aid, yes, we provide aid because some of us believe, and I will say this on Ronald Reagan's birthday, some of us believe that America really is, and it should be, a city shining brightly on the hill for all the world to see. That is one of the reasons why we do it. The other reason goes back to what I've been saying this week, when Harry Truman called Herbert Hoover in, two political enemies, two political rivals. But Harry Truman said, you're the person that can organize relief across Europe, across the world, in a world that has been destroyed by World War II. And yes, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, but we're also doing this because hungry mouths become communist mouths, become communist foot soldiers. We have to win Europe. We have to win Western Europe. We cannot allow France and Spain and the Netherlands and all the other countries in Western Europe to fall into communist hands. And I know you know this, David, but it is so short-sighted. Elon Musk calling these people worms and this and that and the other. Our aid work in the Ivory Coast, it helps us get intel on Al-Qaeda. Our aid work in Sudan, it helps us get intel on ISIS. We can do two things at once, all over Africa, all over the Southern Hemisphere, where people wish to do America ill. Our aid work not only wins hearts and minds, but it helps us draw in intelligence on those who would blow up buildings in New York City, in Washington, D.C., in Charlotte, North Carolina, across America. That is what is so extraordinarily short-sighted about this.
You're exactly right. The generosity of the United States through programs like USAID is scorned by Donald Trump as a sign of American weakness. And it's the opposite. It's seen around the world as evidence that the United States, for all of its mistakes, still has a heart and still has an ability to deal with the most painful, difficult problems there are. I have been collecting in the last week and a half examples of what happens when these clinics close down in Africa, in Asia. People who have been depending on doctors who were funded by USAID suddenly have no place to go. The doctors are on their way home. They've all received the notices that this is over. And people are looking at each other in these countries wondering, what do we do now? And the answer is pretty simple. Now we turn to China. Now somebody else is going to come in and take up this space that the United States and USAID at a tiny fraction of our budget has been filling. Somebody else will come in and have that, we call it soft power, but it's power. And so that's part of what is ahead, and that I just don't think Elon Musk or anybody in this administration has thought about how quickly the power of the United States that took so long to build up can begin to unravel.
Yeah, raising the question again why Elon Musk, an unelected billionaire from South Africa, is making these decisions. He has called USAID a criminal organization that needs to die. We should remind our viewers, if this really were about efficiency, he wouldn't be going after USAID. A $40 billion annual budget for USAID represents less than 1% of the federal budget here in the United States.